Alafia. I'm Dr. Gloria Lattimore Peace, host and producer of OmniU Presents the H3O Art of Life show, and I'm here today with a wonderful person that I've tried very hard to get on my show, and finally I have her, Reverend Denise Tracy, who is I can't get to this, retired Unitary Universalist. In what sense are you retired, Reverend Tracy?
Well, it means that I don't have a church of my own. So in other words, I can do whatever I want.
Okay, okay.
I'm not willing to move, to another place to have a church. And so about 6 years ago, I just thought, well, I want to retire. And so now I preach and do a lot of things that I want to do.
Right. So there must be another word, because if you're as active as you are, you're also chaplain of the Kane County Sheriff's Office.
Uh-huh.
So as someone who is as active as you are, can't really call themselves retired. We'll have to come up with another concept for that. We haven't figured that out. But the title of this show is Spiritual Matters, Sisters in Ministry. And one of the things that I wanted to say right off the bat was that you mentioned yesterday, for example, how someone had come to you and said they were uncomfortable with a woman being in leadership in the church. And then I thought about the New Testament of the King James Version of the Bible, in which it was women were to be silent in the church, slaves, wives, obey your husbands. All of these rules that applied that would have prevented you from pursuing the very mission that you have had throughout your life. How did you come to break your silence in the church and become a minister?
Well, when I was a child, our family, we lost our home in a terrible flood. And this was in Connecticut, and there were 11 people on our street who died. And what happened was it was the church that really helped us. We waited in the church. My dad was missing. We waited to find, to hear what had happened to him. They thought that he had died in the flood. The church also provided us a place to stay and food and clothing. And I realized at a very young age how much I wanted to do that for other people. And so the church became kind of a home to me. And so really the church was a place that I felt called to serve. When I was 10, I decided to be a minister. I had never met a woman minister. There weren't any at that point. And I went to theological school in 1971, never having met a woman minister. I have no idea what I thought I was doing at the time, but I believed what people told me, that God saw everybody equally. And so I just decided, well, if that's the case, I'm going to go and do this.
Well, God is no respecter of persons, as we read in the very same book that says women be silent in the church. Well,
but you have to think about Jesus, I think. Jesus treated everybody equally. He did not, I think that all the stories about the women that he affirmed, and the early church with the Essenes and the early Christian church, women were leaders equally with men. It wasn't until the early church fathers that they started having all of these rules about women. So, I mean, I think that what happens is that I don't believe that Jesus saw women as being less than. I think Jesus was a feminist.
Oh my goodness. Well, this is Spiritual Matters, and we might as well call this Spirituality Without Borders, because that's the direction we're headed in. Well, actually, when you a patriarchal society.
Yes.
And it's a patriarchal society from which all of these ruminations came.
Rules, yes.
All of these rules came in a matriarchal society where women, the all of the inheritance is passed down through the women. Women have roles of reverence.
Right.
You don't find the same kind of leaning. And sometimes I think that the Bible actually has 3 books and not just 2, not the New Testament and the Old Testament, but they have the Paul Testament.
Right.
And it is where you find, in all of these epistles, is where you find all of these rules
Right.
and regulations, which seems to me to be the handiwork of a single person rather than, but it was followed so religiously. So how did you decide which way you wanted to go once you decided to become a minister? Then you had to become a minister in a denomination that would accept a
Well,
woman as a minister.
when I originally went to theological school, I there were very few women. There were 6 women and 600 men. And all the classes began with good morning or good afternoon, gentlemen. When I went, everybody was required to take a psychological exam. There was an Austrian man who was a Freudian. And at the end of the psychological exam, he told me that I didn't need to worry about my grades because I was going to get my MRS degree because I was pretty and someone would marry me and then I could be a minister's wife. And I left that room. I was just enraged. I had spent all this money to go to theological school and to pay for the classes and everything, and the school was not for me. But now that was in 1971. By 1974, the incoming class in 1974 was 1/2 women. So in a 3-year period, there was a revolution in many theological schools. And that had a lot to do with the Vietnam War and ending, and all the draft dodgers who had been in theological school left, and they needed students, and women were eager to apply. So it's a surprising thing. It happen quickly when there's a need for it. But the incoming class in 1/2 women at the school, and I went to a liberal Protestant school.
Were you originally Unitarian Universalist?
No. I grew up in the United Church of Christ, and when I went for my interview at the end of my first year before the committee, they told me that they were not ready for a woman to have her own pulpit, that I could work with children, but I couldn't have my own church. And I served on a committee. There were 8 theological schools in Boston, and I served as the chair of a consortium committee. And there was a woman on the committee who was in her 60s who was Unitarian Universalist. And I came in and I was very upset because in 1 week I'd been told that I was going to marry a minister, and then I was told that I could only work with children. And I was really quite irked. And she said, "What's the matter?" And so I told her this story, and she said, "Well," she said, "Unitarian Universalists, we're as sexist as everybody else, but we'll have you." And so what happened was she made an appointment to headquarters of the UUA, which is in Boston, and ministry and changed denominations in one afternoon. And so that's how I became a Unitarian Universalist.
Well, you know, I like the motto of the church: wherever you are, whoever you are welcome here.
Right.
And that's why I said spirituality without borders. Their sexism has been modified because they are no longer, or at least not where I can see, that are they so conscious as to how to treat, how to discriminate against women in the church.
Well, I will say that right now, inside Unitarian Universalism, over one half of our ministry is women. And so, and I think that has changed the entire denomination.
And you have been a part of that change.
I have.
Well, I'm certainly happy that you are a part of that change. Now, I have told you repeatedly that I enjoy your sermons. I do. I would not miss a one if there was any way for me to be there. And you did a sermon that I asked you for a copy of about Be the One.
Yes.
Talk to me about how you choose these sermons and what you thought, what your thoughts were when you chose that particular one.
It can be a line in a song. It can be an article. It can be a book that I've read. For the sermon, Be the One, I realized that every single person has somebody that believes in them, or we hope that they do. And it started with a conversation that I had with a friend of mine who's a therapist, and she said that she had a client who came from a very destructive family, and the parents were always beating on each other, and they were alcoholics and addicts. The kids were often put in foster care because the parents were taking care of them. And one day when she was about 12, this young girl was sitting on the stairs and her parents were being taken away. A police officer stopped and said to her, "You don't have to live like this. You can make different choices." She never saw him again. But at the age of 40, she's in therapy with my friend who's a therapist, and she goes back to that moment when somebody saw something about her life and gave her a doorway. That one, those two sentences changed her life. That when she has the chance to make a choice, she thinks about the choice differently because of that police officer. She never saw the officer again, but in less than 30 seconds, that police officer gave her a choice of a different life. And so I got to thinking about my own life, and my 8th grade English teacher, a woman named Mrs. Keppel, who just believed in me. I mean, I was a wilting violet. I was very quiet. I slunk down in my chair. And she called me in after school one day, and I thought I was in trouble. And she said, "Why don't you speak up? I know that you're smart. I want to hear what you have to say." And then from that point on, every one afternoon a week, I went in and helped her with her plants. And it was a half an hour once a week, but I knew that she thought that I had potential. And I tried to live up to that potential. And I thought, she was my one. My one. The idea is that everybody has somebody that believes in them. It could be a minister or a teacher or a grandparent or an aunt or a godparent.
Or a passing police officer.
Or a passing police officer. And what happens is that if we have that person, we're so fortunate. But I think it goes one step further, and that is that we try to live our lives so that we can be the one for someone else. We can give somebody a hand or give somebody a compliment. You never know what people are going through. My husband likes to say, all you have to do is just scratch the surface, and you'll find that people have struggles or pain, and one another with kindness and a kind of reverence for the other person. That people know that, and they can feel that and experience it. And so, like this client of a friend of mine, she hung on to those words. I mean, she's now in her 40s. Remembers that. I'm in my 60s, and my 8th grade English teacher. I'm sure that I became a minister because she believed in me. She just believed that I could be anything I wanted to be. And so I'm forever grateful for that.
It's wonderful when you go to a person or to a group of people who have inspired you, validated you, because that is what we all seek, is validation by people who receive love.
Yes.
And Dr. Margaret Burroughs was such a person for me. And she has a saying that I she says, I am just one. You know, I'm not everybody. I'm not everybody, but I am one. And I can't do everything, but I can do something.
Right.
And what I can do, I ought to do. And what I ought to do, I must see ourselves as being uniquely perhaps equipped. You never know when you're being the one. Sometimes what you are doing that is the one that will impress someone that way. So you always have to be conscious of yourself, of your behavior,
Yes.
of what you're saying, because you are, in fact, the one, whether you chose to be the one or not. And up to be, as you are, a quote, retired Unitarian Universal minister, then those persons whom you are citing as having influenced your development can take some pride in having been a part of your development, that you have grown up to be the person who has been the one in the lives of so many people. And when you say the reference that you have for others, you must see God, the omnipresent God, everywhere and in everyone. And so you have the same, what is it, love thy neighbor as thyself. You have the same reverence for that person as you have for yourself. Hopefully you have some for yourself. But the point is that, you know, that when you brought that as a sermon, you know, be one to us, that we're always being the one somewhere, and we need to be more cognizant of it. You always come with a timely sermon. When you brought this anecdote about the woman coming to you telling you that, you know, had still a deep attachment to the Christian church as she knew it, and could not really be comfortable with you at the beginning because you were a woman. Talk to me about that a little bit.
Well, it was 1976, where I was the woman minister. It was new for me. It was new for everybody. I was the only person in my congregation of a couple of hundred people who was honest to us. I've always had male ministers prefer that. And it was like, okay, well, I can't do anything about that. And, you know, can we try to work this out? And I appreciate for being honest, be the person that kind of says, well, I know I'm supposed to like this, but I'm not quite about it. Over time, I became a very close ally, because I think I just supported what she felt being judged. I mean, I knew I had never met a woman minister when I went to theological school. I mean, it wasn't as if I had 30 people to look up to. I really didn't. So that part of it, I think, being honest. we believe, and having the courage to say, I'm not so sure about this, I want to learn more about it, know more about it, and see where it ends up.
Well, you know, being the first anything is always hard. It's always after the fact, you know, long after the fact,
Right.
very often, that you will then be cheered and lauded because you were the first. But you were in some circles where they didn't want to ever have a first.
Yes.
And they knew that if they ever admitted a first, be some seconds and thirds and so on, it was spread, and you were blasphemous if you were the one who was doing it. That you persevered, I think she undoubtedly gained respect for you because you didn't oppose her and you didn't try to dissuade her. You just kept being who you were, realized that you were not a threat.
Well, I understand she had done a lot of work on women's history. And so I knew the story of Antoinette Brown, who was the very first woman to graduate from theological school and the very first woman to be in the congregation. When she went to theological school, she wasn't allowed to speak in class, allowed to deliver a sermon. Now this was 8, but she had to go in a barn and get a whole group of women to sit and listen so that she could practice preaching. I mean, imagine, I could go and preach places. You know, there had been some progress. 1853, when she was ordained, imagine how radical that was. You know, and then you kind of leap forward to 1974 when I was ordained. There were at least women who were in who were doing things in churches, but when Antoinette Brown was there in the 1850s, I don't think that women were allowed to be deacons in churches or serve communion or all of those kinds of things. So change happens slowly, but I remember reading about those early women and thinking, oh my gosh, do that, and being inspired and strengthened by their stories.
And I'm glad you were strengthened because you might have gotten gun shy. But you know, there's this interesting book that I brought with you. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's called God is Not a Muslim, a Hindu. God dwells with us, in us, around us, as
What a
us.
Wonderful idea.
Well, this man was a bishop, and he was one of the foremost Pentecostal bishops. And when he came to this revelation, he lost a very huge congregation and was thought of as a heretic of some kind. Bishop Carlton Pearson.
Well, he Oklahoma. He now belongs, and he merged his church with All Souls in Tulsa. There's a movie about him.
I know there's a movie about him. I'm bringing up this book because
he lost everything.
He
lost his
everything, every integrity.
Right.
Because it is quite something to have the courage of your convictions and to stand for what you believe in no matter the cost, which makes him far more convincing than he would be if he had caved in.
Yes.
And so when he speaks of God as principle, you know, and I think not only the PLE principle, but I think of the PAL principle. If you understand that, then you know that we are not talking gender here.
Right.
And if you also understand presence, then you know that equally present everywhere means exactly that, that you are never somewhere not.
That's right.
And if you understand omnipotence, you understand all power. You know, if you understand omniscience, you understand all intelligence or all knowing. And so if you have a broader view, if you have limitless, infinite view of the infinite, then you won't get into the kinds of problems that you get into when you limit that which is limitless.
Right.
Which is, how dare men decide, how dare, with his ulterior motives, decide that he could decide what should be written and by whom it should be written and what should not be included, because there are lost books
Oh, sure.
of the Bible, except they're not lost. They're sitting in occult bookstores, and now some of them are on Amazon.
Yes.
So they're not lost. So there's a whole lot more that was said than we read about, and we are not changing as we become more informed. In fact, we are not seeking to be more informed. Knock and ye shall be open, seek and ye shall find does not seem to apply. When I was a little girl, they would always say, you don't question God. You never ask questions relative to God. And it occurred to me one day, God is not afraid of my question.
Let's hope not.
I can ask whatever I want to. I'm invited to ask. Mm-hmm. And I'll ask. So the thing is to try to limit what is limitless, to try to make finite what is infinite, is the problem that we have with respect to religion. That's why some people say, well, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. Be boxed into these little categories.
Sure, sure. Well, I always would tell my children that there is one God, and there are many beliefs and many practices and many images, and that we're not confined to anyone. Mm-hmm. And if you think about God being in everyone and everything, it gives you tremendous respect for the earth. It gives you tremendous respect and reverence for people, and we just walk more gently and talk more gently, and it's an important idea to live a spiritual life.
Absolutely. And you know, when you think about the rules and regulations that I need for codes, for rules, for regulations, mm-hmm. but understand that they were entered into voluntarily. These that we make in order that we may live together, that we may live together in harmony. Mm-hmm. We decided to make these contracts with each other, not so that we could regulate each other's way the world. There is never only one way of looking at the world. But, you know, somehow somebody got a hold to a notion of the divine right of kings. Mm-hmm. And with the divine the king's right to organize every aspect of life, which is so Western and so plural, because Bishop Pearson said if he had wanted religion in his bedroom, he would have given it a key. So why are you trying to be all things to all people? You went down to the minute degree everything that people think and do, but I guess they will never stop trying.
Well, you have to think about, you have to have a line down the middle with people driving on either side.
Right.
There's some of that makes people safe.
Right.
There's some that's unnecessary. My parents grew up and lived in Vermont for the last 40 years of their lives, and when Vermont became the first state that passed marriage equality, my parents were very conservative, and so I was riding with my dad in his truck when I went to visit, and we went by a barn with a pink triangle painted on it, which was, of course, supporting marriage equality. So I decided to kind of ask him what he thought, you know, because I thought, oh, do I really want to know? You know, because if he doesn't, you know, and so he said to me, I think that the government should not be in anybody's bedroom. And he said, and I think that the right to be as miserable as everybody else. And and I just thought, oh my gosh. And so, I mean, it was, to me, he was really saying that it's nobody's business, and it wasn't his business, and that, and I just laugh and laugh at that, you know, that he came to that on his own. Everybody to be miserable, but it just was his way, his way of saying, you know, mind your own.
Again, here's a social contract, people choosing each other as partners, now becoming a legal entity.
Right.
That you need to go and give somebody a fee to give you a piece of paper called a license, so that you live in a particular way. You will not have a socially approved relationship entitled to the rewards or privileges that the society allots to those who follow the rule of getting the piece of paper and standing before the
says.
So, but the thing is that, you know, marriages are made in heaven, as it said. Two people's decision to relate to each other should not rest in the hands of people who have no vested interest in that relationship. Now, in some communities, there have been such vested relationships that families had to approve of these relationships, you know, and there had to be, you know, some negotiations of sorts and what have you before the people were allowed to choose each other. And sometimes in some societies, they were not even or
they were mergers with family fortunes. You know, that's what the Middle Ages. I mean, the Middle Ages, you know, I was, whenever they sent young men to somebody else's camp, I mean, it was to find a partner. And I mean, you know, the young men went and lived there for several years, and I mean, that was up with larger pieces of property for the family and mergers. I don't know. I mean, I suppose it's a way to do it, but I think.
But it's the associated to what is a natural attraction between two people who decide that this is how they want to relate to each other.
Yes.
Unless that is causing harm to a community, to a society, then the society ought not to be involved in that. If the society has no vested interest, if it is not in some way disrupting the life, if it is disrupting the business of society, is where society gets concerned. You know, if the capital is going to be in some way abridged or depleted, then we have to know about this.
Well, I think it's interesting that what has ended up happening is when I went to theological school, I was not trained at all on gay issues or same. It didn't even come up, I don't believe, you know, and so I graduated from 1974 and went to Connecticut, and sent a letter out to all of my colleagues and said, if you have extra weddings or if you need somebody to preach, this ministry, and I got a call from a young man who wanted to get married, and he set up an appointment. And when he arrived, he was very, and
You were looking.
I said, where is the bride? And they said that they had been to 8 churches and that nobody would talk. And so we sat and talked for a while, and I said, well, I don't know anything about this, but I'm not saying no, but let me find out about it and I'll call you. And so I have a friend who was part of college, which is a church, was really one of the only churches at that point that had a ministry to gay people. And I said, what do I do? And she said, well, you need to figure out who you support in terms of your ordination receiving a blessing in the eyes of God. And she said, if it's only certain people, then you have to be able to follow theology. So I that if I had a child who was gay, I would want to. I was gay, I would want the church to support me. So I called these 2 young men and I said, I don't know what I'm doing. And if we can work together, I had to legal at the time, but it was considered a holy union. It was a religious ceremony. And I remember putting on my robe in this church in Meriden, Connecticut, and a woman came in and she was very angry and she said, you are damning my son to hell in doing this ceremony. And I thought, oh my. And so we sat and talked for a minute, and I said, during the ceremony, watch your son's face, and then we can talk afterwards. And during the ceremony, the 2 were cry. I mean, it was so obvious that they loved each other. After the ceremony was over, I was taking my room, and she came in and she said, you're right. My son is in love. And I said, and he's going to need your support. He needs your support. It's a brave thing he's doing, you know, and so I didn't know what I was doing, but since 1974, I've done ceremonies for gay couples since that time, and it was the right thing. It was the right thing. I didn't know what I was doing. You step out and kind of say, where is God in this? You know, how can I be reverent to the people here? How can I serve in a way that's godly? And I know that I did the right thing then, even if I didn't know it when I began it. By the end of that first ceremony, I thought, this is a good thing. And what ended up happening is the fact that I had done one ceremony, the word got out. And then I had all of these couples that wanted, and some of them had been together for years and years and years and didn't know anybody to support. So I felt like it was a blessed thing.
I feel like it too. I was once in a church where the minister, there was a practice of bringing the children to become members of the church, but under the supervision of their parents, actually becoming ministers, but not quite on their own. And at that time, they were being christened or baptized or in some ritual to the church community. And I remember this minister doing a huge congregation saying that he could not christen or baptize one or the other, this child, because the child was born out of wedlock.
Oh.
And he said as well, he would not do it if it was his own grandchild who was born out of wedlock. This couple was humiliated.
Oh, that's terrible.
Before the whole congregation because they went for and were refused publicly. It was just I could not that. you know, and I just quoted all these scriptures. He said, you know, he quoted Paul, follow me as I follow Jesus, and he decided that in some way he was following Jesus, and so the congregation was follow Jesus. And I just quoted him what Jesus said about suffer the little children who to come unto me and forbid them not, for such is the. I sent that to him in a letter. Don't stand there and tell me to follow you as you follow Jesus when you're not even true to the scriptures that you proclaim that you follow. It was that left a burning.
Oh yes.
I shall never forget that. But these mortals who take it upon themselves to stand in lieu of these sacred figures from history, such as Jesus, you are going to cite someone who is exactly the opposite side of what you're doing as being your reason for doing it. So sometimes you have to let your heart, your compassion, your spirit, and tell you what the right thing is to do. Now, finding out whether or not it's permissible in the denomination where you are is one thing. You know, are we allowed to do this? We are. But the point is that so many individuals take it upon themselves the infinite without knowing the infinite, without bothering to seek, to look within and to see what it is that they are doing and not doing and in whose name, and stop blaming it. Stop blaming it on people who bear no responsibility for your actions, because your actions are entirely outside of what that person or that principle would espouse.
Well, I think it's important always to realize that, I mean, I think about that little child, and I think about those parents, and I hope they left that church.
Well, I did.
I hope they left that church. I really think that, can you imagine the scarring of that? Can you imagine having to live with that?
I don't know. I think the child was very young, so I don't think the child was scarred, but I know that the parents had to be.
Well, and I think about it, you know, Mary was born out of Mary got pregnant outside of marriage. I mean, how do you, and Jesus was a child of love.
Were Adam and Eve married? Let's see, who was in the garden? Adam and Eve. Now, who performed the ceremony? Well, Cain and Abel were they born in wedlock?
I have no
Well,
idea.
see, the thing is, don't preach this to me, because I have a Doctor of Divinity degree in theology. I didn't want to be a minister. I just wanted to understand some theology.
Right.
So I bothered to study. And I think that when people decide that they're going to start citing references and quoting scripture, they just need to read the book that they claim that they are abiding by, because otherwise it makes it a mockery, you know. And, you know, they got another one, be not deceived, God is not mocked. So, you know, if you are doing things in the name, it would, for me, that's like forgery or fraud or something. If you go down and open up a name and I didn't authorize you to do it, you know, you could go to jail. People get damned to hell. They go to hell for fraud.
Well, I think it's also important to remember that a lot of the scriptures that Paul has written were specific to congregations that were having trouble. And so what he was trying to do was to say, in this particular church, put this rule in place because people are not behaving well. I don't think he meant them to be universal rules. I think he meant them to be, if you have this kind of situation that you could put in place, he didn't put it in stone that we all have to be like that. So I think it's important to take the story and to understand the context.
And to understand that this is, I mean, there's no attempt to be, this
Right.
says the King James Version.
It's
The author, the King James Version, which means this is not the only version. There are
Yes.
of Bibles.
Yeah.
Cultures have Bibles created for their perspective.
That's right.
And for people to have tolerance, this tolerance I would hope for. Spiritual tolerance you can assume, you can claim that it is to claim. Well, I think that we've got a long way to go, but it's just in the way that in days of old there were things that people recommended and thought would be in our best interest for us to practice. Sometimes experience, wisdom teaches us to eliminate some of these things, modify some of these things, and utilize or not utilize these things.
Well, I don't know about you, but do you remember that women didn't wear slacks? Women did not wear pants. It was a radical thing in the early 1970s when the first woman wore a pantsuit. Now, she still had matching shoes and a matching purse
And earrings.
and earrings and a hat and gloves, but she wore pants for weeks.
You didn't come to church in them. You might wear them socially, but you didn't show up in church.
Well, and I middle school 2 days a week, and I say to them, I never wore slacks to school in life. And they're all like, what? And I said it wasn't permitted, and we never wore jeans. We weren't to wear except to play in the fields or out on the, on the basketball court. I mean, look at the kinds of ways that has changed.
And it has done no harm
Nobody's,
to anyone.
I know. Yep.
Well, I think that probably some people will probably argue that some of these changes is what has led us down the slippery slope leading to women wanting to assume identities other than feminine identities and men wanting to assume other than masculine identities. Because everybody looks for a starting point where this started, what the cause of every change, what precipitated it. We may never know what caused any change, but any change that is not harmful to us in any of the ways that matters, spiritually, emotionally, physically. I put on likely, because if the others get satisfied, I'm going to question why I have to keep worrying about the bottom line over here.
Sure.
Yeah, but I appreciate you and everything that you contribute, and that, I'm glad that your retirement is a misnomer and that you continue to do the work that you do, and I hope that you will continue to do it. You travel great distances to do this work. It would seem to me it would be easier if you didn't have to travel.
I like it.
You like it.
I'm delighted.
I'm delighted. Thank you for having me.
I'm glad I had you. Aren't you glad?
Yes, I
Did you
am.
think an hour was too long? You
Was
said-
it an hour, really?
You said, I think an hour is a long time.